you could say to me, wait a minute, look at this mother. She is coming from a place of love because she's offering to help him. But I hope I made this clear already. That is not necessarily a gesture of love. On the surface, it looks that way. But as I mentioned a moment ago, this also sends an implicit message that I don't trust you, that you can't do this on your own. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissismdecoder, a podcast that takes a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. The title of this episode, which I think is appropriate given that we're coming up on the holidays, is This is What Happens When the Narcissist Returns Home for a Family Visit, the Unrelenting Loop of Despair. In this episode, we explore authentic personal stories shared by individuals, highlighting the hurdles they encounter during their visits home. These captivating narratives, curated from my thorough social media content review, are a synthesis of diverse experiences encountered both in the online realm and within my private practice. This approach enables us to concentrate on overarching themes, explore potential underlying causes, and discuss effective treatments or solutions for similar situations. Picture this one scenario. And I say one scenario because, of course, there are many different iterations of what can happen when one returns home. But this is one example. And this example, you may notice right away, leaves out the usual, first night or first day experience of the blissful union that typically incorporates some alcohol and intoxication of some sort. But in this example, a self-proclaimed narcissist returns home for the holidays. He's not gainfully employed and is working below his capacities. He knows he's dependent on alcohol and drugs, and his life is not where he wants or thinks it should be. So when he gets home, in the family discussion, he talks to the family members, and you could fill in this piece based on your own situation or what you're familiar with. But he talks about not having any interesting hobbies in his life, for instance, or feeling alienated. He doesn't have any close, good friends, or he's not romantically involved. He needs a job. It could be any one of these scenarios, but he talks to the family about where he is in his life. And overall, he's fine getting suggestions from various relatives until his mother said that she'll send him some, again, fill it in, social clubs that he could join or job advertisements. Heck, she may even set him up on a date, right? But something is offered to him, in other words. He immediately becomes dysregulated and, using his words, he unloads on her. He attacks her for thinking that he is a pathetic loser. And he is describing the details of this attack on her. But as he's doing this, he begins to actively question, why do I assume that she's judging me? Now, he has some intellectual, let's say, or cognitive knowledge that he's assuming something. He's assuming that she's judging him. And he demonstrates this knowledge when he states that he's projecting his own self-hatred. Again, his words. And you heard this, or you hear this quite commonly in the community, that the narcissist projects. He knows this, but when his mother makes a slightly inappropriate comment, and by the way, she's not innocent in this, and we could talk about that, he immediately becomes convinced that he was being called a pathetic failure. He explodes on her, and he lets her know that he has more skills and intellect than her or anybody in the family, and that he can find his own hobbies or job, right? because he proclaims he is great. And yes, they actually say this sort of stuff, that they're great, they're exceptional, they're like God. He continues to tell himself that people are coming from a place of concern when they say things like this to him. But nevertheless, despite saying this, he feels like someone is shaming him. A family member told him, your mother was coming from a place of compassion. But he could not hear that. And again, he became dysregulated and went off the deep end, using again his words, and lashed out. The shame and everything that he was holding within himself, he says, just comes pouring out. As he continues to let us into his inner world, he talks about how nobody ever cares about him, that everybody at work thinks that he's pathetic, that he's not good enough, and he hated who he was as a child. Since an early age, everyone judged and shamed him. The spiral continues into overwhelming feelings that everyone thinks he's a pathetic failure. He's constantly feeling judged, and the extent of his suffering is palpable. Okay, now that I've described the profound struggle and emotional turmoil experienced by this individual, let's pivot our perspective and explore this further. It's important to acknowledge that our understanding is based on the description that I just provided. We may not have a comprehensive view of his entire inner world, but we have enough information to clearly see certain thought patterns. In what I just described, if you're thinking about it, what is most clear? In other words, what stands out to you? What I see are overwhelming feelings of judgment and shame that contribute to his unrelenting loop of despair. That's the spiral that I mentioned. By examining this narrative through a psychoanalytic framework, we seek insights into the underlying mechanisms that perpetuate his experience of shame. So let's start with a few basic assumptions, and then we'll build on that, as always. For the narcissist, what is the most important thing? Knowing what you know about narcissism, what do you think? What's the most important thing for this fellow? The narcissist places an incredibly high value on themselves and their own self-worth. They seek constant validation and admiration from others, right? We know this. Why do they do this? To reinforce what I think is the most important and central piece of the narcissistic characteristics is what? The grandiose sense of self, the omnipotence. That's the structure that holds them together and must constantly be fed. Recognition, praise, and attention are crucial to maintaining their sense of self-importance. If we listen closely to that which preceded this fellow's explosion, he says that his mother commented that she would send him something, like a social club to join, a job advertisement, or as I mentioned, even someone to date, right? So now you may be saying, so what? His mother offered to help him and send him some local clubs, right, that he can join or job possibilities. What's the big deal? Again, if we look at this from a psychoanalytic perspective, we know, I'm going back a little bit here to childhood, but that the child does not just expect food, right, from the caregiver, but also needs and desires love and understanding, which is expressed through the mother's handling of the baby. This leads to certain unconscious feelings of oneness that is based on the unconscious of the mother and the child being in close relation to each other. And the child, both of them actually, but there's a feeling of being understood. This is what we call emotional attunement. This is what we call containing. There are many different words for this. But in short, There's the child, the baby, the developing child, they get what they need. So let's go back, because he tells us that he felt judged by his mother. And this quickly spiraled into unrelenting, persecutory thoughts of being a pathetic failure. In his mind, she breaks the bond between them. She does not respond to him with sympathy or understanding. Instead, she frustrates him, right? In his mind, again, with judgments. He is now feeling persecuted and quickly enters into what we call, again, borrowing from psychoanalytic language, a persecutory state of mind. He's persecuted. And by the way, do you hear the judgment from his mother? I mean, if you listen closely and you could really look at it from this individual's perspective, what do you hear in her offer to help him? See, because there is an implicit message here. And this is part of what happens when the narcissist returns home. It's not just that the narcissist is some kind of dysfunctional individual. Remember, he or she got this way for a reason. Something in their early childhood, in this family environment, went missing. And I've spoken a lot more about this in earlier episodes. So he's returning to what I call the scene of the crime, right? So when someone goes home, there's this potential to regress. Of course, that's there. They're returning to the scene of the crime, but the participants are not all so innocent. So here, let me just give you a quick example of this. What's the implicit message in the mother's comment about sending him the job offer, helping him get a girlfriend to date, right? Again, fill in the blank. The implicit message is, and I think that this is what he's responding to, you are not capable. In other words, I must do this for you. I must save you because you cannot manage this on your own. In fact, you can't even manage your own life without me. I need to come in and take care of this. You're not a grown adult. I know you could say that I'm speculating here, and it's true, this is speculation. But at the same time, I do think it is part of the implicit message. Why does a mother need to come in and help a grown adult find a job, for instance? That really does send a message that I don't trust that you're capable of doing this on your own. You need my help. And we do know with the narcissist, I've mentioned this again in earlier episodes, is that oftentimes they come from families where the mother or caregiver has their own conflict about letting the child individuate, make their own mistakes. See, because oftentimes these parents have their own conflicts about separation and individuation. So what happens with this fellow in this example that I'm giving is there are now destructive impulses about how frustrated he feels, and hate gets stirred up by it. And there is an incapacity to be comforted when another family member tries to reassure him that the mother is just coming from a place of concern. Because for him, it feels like she's shaming me. Simple as that. And that's the implicit message that I just mentioned that I think he is tuning into. So why does he feel so judged? Where does this interpretation come from? In other words, what are the origins? I know I just spoke about this a little bit, but let's keep going with this. Developmentally, we know that being loved builds confidence in one's own self, as well as in other people's goodness. So love builds confidence in goodness. We can speculate that in this fellow's early childhood, there was not enough love. There was not enough understanding or empathic connectedness to outbalance his inner angry world. Now, again, I'm just digressing, but you could say to me, wait a minute, look at this mother. She is coming from a place of love because she's offering to help him. But I hope I made this clear already. That is not necessarily a gesture of love. On the surface, it looks that way, But as I mentioned a moment ago, this also sends an implicit message that I don't trust you, that you can't do this on your own. Okay, so let's go back. So while he doesn't say much about his childhood in this example that I gave, he does say that starting in early childhood, he's felt judged and criticized. See, that's a hint that there must have been something already going on in his early environment. But who did he turn to with these early painful feelings? Did he turn to anyone? And if not, why? Perhaps he felt no one was in his family who could really understand him. In other words, he did not feel that there was someone in the family that he could turn to that would understand him and not judge him or not take over his experience like his mother did with this job situation that I just mentioned. The feelings would be taken over by her. So instead of bringing it to her, he keeps it inside. And I think you can imagine this situation. Like, picture this. You turn to a caregiver with a concern and it's minimized in some way, or the caregiver begins telling you about their concerns. Here's a very simple example. You tell a caregiver that your knee hurts. I'm just making this up, right? And the response you get is, you think your knee hurts. Let me tell you something about pain. When I gave birth to your sister, did you know that my pelvis cracked? That's pain. But I see, I'm making this up, but I think you get the point. Unpleasant experiences and the lack of enjoyable ones, especially the lack of close contact with happy, loving people, increases ambivalence, diminishes trust and hope, and also confirms anxieties about external persecution. So, wait, let me say that again. So, unpleasant experiences like the one that I just mentioned, this is an unpleasant experience when you go to a caregiver and you're invalidated, right? If there is more of that than there are enjoyable experiences, this increases ambivalence. So now you have mixed feelings that you don't know what to do with. You can't get the love and the resentment together. And by the way, this is part of splitting, and this is part of the extreme positions that some of these individuals take. They can't get the ambivalence together. They cannot trust. And when you can't trust, then it's so easy to feel like the environment is dangerous. And that's the external persecution that I just mentioned. Destructive impulses towards anybody are always bound to give rise to the feeling that the person will also become hostile and retaliatory. So that's a lot. Let me break that piece down, because you might be saying, wait a minute, how does that work? How do inner feelings of anger or frustration give rise to an experience of a judging, hostile, and retaliatory external environment? And that's a good question. So let's talk about that. This fellow is trying to figure out his relationship with external reality. As he questions, he says, why do I care so much about people who I view as beneath me? Why do I care so much about what they think about me? The idea of anyone who doesn't like me, he tells me, it drives me crazy. Like they have this opinion of me, and I don't want them to hold that. They are telling everybody I'm such a loser, that I'm so pathetic. And I care what other people think about me. And even that's pathetic. I can't even believe I just admitted that to you, because I don't want to think that I care about what other people think of me. I mean, that's embarrassing to admit. But I know, and I can say, and I know this cognitively, like intellectually. And this is very, very common, by the way, because there's enough sort of content out there in the social media world where they could read and they could say, nobody is thinking about you that much. And he knows this and he gets it. But nevertheless, in his mind and in his emotions, in his emotional responses, everybody is judging me, he says. Everybody sees me as a pathetic loser without a good job, without a relationship. So if we borrow again from psychoanalytic theory, we can begin to answer this fellow's questions. Because what's he saying? Why does this bother me so much? According to the theory, and what I have seen also in my own clinical work with narcissistic individuals, are what we call defenses. In other words, the ego built up omnipotent and violent fantasies for many different reasons, but I will focus on the use of these defenses for the purpose of controlling and mastering the bad, dangerous inner world. In my field, what we call objects, right? Because they're not really internalized. Like their inner world is not populated by loving, whole objects. Remember, their inner world is populated by what? Part objects who are persecutory in nature. That's why I said bad, dangerous objects, and they must be mastered. Okay, but what are these bad, dangerous objects? And where do they come from? They don't just appear magically, you must be saying. Or why are these individuals full of bad, dangerous objects? So let's return to a concept that's familiar. I think that's familiar to all of you. And to this fellow, of course, he said he's projecting. So that which is projected is typically what? Why do we project? Projection is a defense mechanism that's designed to get rid of something that's objectionable within inside of us. So in other words, if we have painful feelings, right, shameful feelings, we eject them, we get rid of them, we put them onto people in our environment. So that which is projected is typically hostile. That which is bad in us and cannot be tolerated gets projected out. Therefore, as you can imagine, the character of projection is of great importance in thinking about our relationships to other people. In other words, we really need to understand projection, not in a way that this fellow and most people use it. Oh, yes, I'm just projecting a bad part of myself, and I imagine that other people see me as bad, right? That's true. But how's that going to really help? You could see it doesn't help him in the example that I gave. I know it doesn't help because he could say it and understand this cognitively, but he continues to spiral, as do most people. So back to projection, commonly used when you look at the content on narcissism. But we need to keep in mind, if we are not dominated by hostility and aggression, in other words, if our inner world is well balanced, then our inner world is enriched and the relationships with the external world are improved. However, we can see in this example that I gave, the projections are hostile. He is angry at his mother. He projects his anger into her, onto her, into the world, and believes he's being attacked and judged, right? That's the attack. When you're being judged, you are under attack. Can you imagine that you can't even leave your apartment? That's how far this goes. You can't leave, in other words, you can't leave your house because you're convinced that people are watching and judging you. Stated differently, the processes. Oh, let me just say one other thing. If we're going to talk about projection, we have to talk about introjection, which I don't think is something that's given far enough importance in the content, at least not the content that I see. It's very common to see projection, but how often do you see introjection? And you cannot talk about projection without thinking about introjection. So what is introjection? Introjection is a process by which you take in. It's what you take in from the external environment. Now, his what he takes in is, as you could see, dominated by what? Aggression, anxiety, his judgments, and he's constantly feeling persecuted. So he's in this perpetual loop because in his inner world is built up. This is the introjection, and in large part is a reflection of his external world. In other words, his inner world becomes populated with what? Judging, hostile, persecutory objects, because that's what he's projecting. Remember? So he has this in him. He projects it into his environment because this is how he sees other people. Remember, he can't even leave his house without somebody watching him. But now this becomes the world in which he lives. So if you live in this kind of world, what is it you're going to take in? You're not taking in loving, caring, concerned, considerate people. You're taking in people who are constantly judging you. Does that make sense? I hope I didn't confuse you too much. But the main point, what I'm trying to communicate is he tells us that he's obsessing about what people are thinking about me. That's what he says, that I'm pathetic. The sad truth is he cannot objectively think about what other people are really thinking about him. Sorry about that. I know that sounds a little confusing, but what I'm saying is he can't be objective. None of us can. But for him, external reality becomes far more, I was going to say confusing, but it's not even confusing. That's the problem. See, and that goes into the work that we need to do with this fellow or with anybody who you know, or with yourself or anybody you know or that you're close to who's in this kind of experience. See, it's not confusing is part of the problem. And that's part of the problem with every personality disorder is that this stuff is egocentric. You've heard me say this in other episodes. So our goal, of course, is to make it ego dystonic. In other words, he's not questioning this. He assumes that he knows that when he steps outside of his apartment, people are judging him. So he's entrenched in this vicious loop of projection and introjection. But the introjection is of his own hostile introjects. In other words, he puts out in what's in him into the environment, and that's what he takes back in. Okay. Sorry if I digress too far into that, but it's such an important piece of this puzzle. And I really wanted to take a moment to make sure that I was, well, at least trying to make this clear. Okay, so let's press on. So he thinks this is about other people, and he has no awareness that most of this stuff, I say most, not all, because his mother does really behave in a certain way. But he thinks that most of this, he has no awareness that most of this is coming from within. Of course, just to put this into some context, his inner world comes from somewhere. That's what I was just saying. And that this is where his family does actually play a role in keeping this inner dynamic alive. But please keep in mind that which is taken in, right? Introjection. This is all part of our fantasies. This is the psychoanalytic theory, by the way. In other words, we don't really treat things as just a reality. In other words, I'm not going to accept it as just a reality that when he steps out outside of his apartment, everybody is judging him. And since I'm not going to accept that as a reality, naturally, I'm going to be curious about this. And once I understand it from his perspective, then I can begin to help him understand it from a different perspective. And by the way, that's part of making it ego dystonic. Okay. Now, this leads us right into his next question, which may be your question as well. Is there an effective treatment approach? Is there anything that can break this vicious cycle that I'm describing? And I think you already have the answer to this. I think you can hear it in what I'm describing because I'm already demonstrating how we take it from his perspective. Remember, always appreciate the subjectively useful component of a maladaptive experience, right? A maladaptive symptom, understand it from his perspective, and then we're in a much better position if we can hear him. And this is very common. Oftentimes, people first need to feel like they're being heard before they can hear you. Okay. So all of this is part of how do we break this cycle? And oftentimes, these individuals will raise important questions about their behavior. And it's quite troubling to them that these are questions that they cannot answer. They search the internet and typically come up empty handed. That's what they tell me. And that's my own experience as well. You see, in other words, if you look at the social media content, it does an amazing job of describing certain behaviors and patterns, but it falls short when it comes to how do we break these cycles, aside from create healthy boundaries and all the things that you've heard me mention in prior episodes, which typically are not too effective. So, and this is what he tells me, is I discovered this stuff about myself when I read about narcissism, and I'm searching and searching, but I can't figure out, what do I do? How do I fix this? And they want to know, what do I do now? How do I find out? He says, this is what he says. How do I find out? Because a lot of the literature says the narcissist is someone who is just made up of all these different sort of split off parts of themselves, right? And he's like, this is what he's hearing. And he says, how do I find out who I really am? And if that person exists, that's what he says. People want to know the real me. But when I don't live up to their expectations, he says, like what they think is the real me, as if some loving, caring person will just suddenly emerge, and I don't live up to those expectations, he says, then they're going to hate me. By the way, another projection, of course. In other words, these people are not sure about the real me. I put that in air quotes. And they're not sure how to figure this out. If you turn to the social media content, oftentimes the picture that they paint is that there's no true self. This is what I just mentioned a moment ago, right? That these individuals are too split, and there's really no core of an existence to them. Now, here, I think, is what we need to know. In other words, this is what we need to know to answer his question in terms of, how do I break this cycle? How do I figure out if there's a real me? So again, for those of you who have listened to me before, you know it's so important in my mind to always have a theoretical perspective. You need a theory. And when you have a theory, then you just follow it backwards. In other words, if you have a theory in terms of what's causing the problem, that is the cure of the problem. The mechanism of cause is the mechanism of cure. Now, what did I so let's go back. What did I detail earlier? What is the main problem here? We spoke about projection. And this is, again, I'm giving this example and how to work with it in this particular way. But I want to make sure that you're all aware that there are so many different iterations of this. This stuff is very complicated, but I'm trying to keep it tight so at least we cover some basic understanding of what's the problem, where does it come from, and then how do we get ourselves out of this? So let's focus on projection. Let's keep that in mind, okay? So we just stay consistent with what we already know. So with projection, we know that one has painful feelings that get split off and they project them, right? In this case, into his mother. You think I am pathetic. Well, he thinks he's pathetic. Obviously, that's coming from him, right? But then when he spirals, society in general thinks he's pathetic. And this is typically, by the way, when one is projecting and splitting off and giving away parts of themselves, This is what inhibits them. This is what inhibits talents or restricts the personality. And this is the stuff that leads to inhibitions. And this is why we see in his complaints that he has no hobbies. Remember, I said, fill it in, whatever the complaint is. One of them was no hobbies, no job of value that's challenging to him. Or he has problems socializing, dating, and enjoying time with friends and family. This type of person, when he tries to challenge himself, like visit with friends and family, or he tries a new hobby, since he has a basic distrust of others, he feels judged. Remember? He's projecting. So the first order of business is we need to deal with the projection, because no matter what he does, he constantly believes that people are judging him. So when he has these painful feelings, to protect himself, there's typically an increase in the defenses and more violent control of other people, since in his mind, they want to control him. So feelings of persecution, again, have the upper hand. So as soon as he tries to do something, he begins to project. He imagines people are going to control him, judge him, hurt him in some way, right? Remember, these are all acts of violence. So he's feeling persecuted. And then when he feels persecuted, naturally, just like any of us would do, he needs to retreat. Well, first, he may need to fight, like we saw. He needs to fight back because he's under attack, and then he retreats. And that's why it's so hard to get invested in the world with the hobbies and socializing, because he's so busy. His first order of business is just to keep himself safe. We must help him break this unrelenting spiral, because we know that greater trust in actual people will help build a good internal world. Remember, that's the introjection. Thus, introjection, in other words, can operate more freely. More goodness and love could be taken in from outside if we can help him with the projection, right? So we must help him come to see that the feeling of being persecuted, judged, and watched by his colleagues, his friends, and his neighbors is not coming from them. He's being watched by internal bad and persecutory objects. In other words, he's judging. He judges himself. And that's the goal. And the way we do that is already what I mentioned earlier, is to first take it from his perspective, not challenge it, not give him advice. And then we could begin to become curious about how it is that he's so convinced that these people are judging him. And what I have in my work, when I work with these individuals, is what happens, this is what happens. When persecution diminishes, by helping them begin to look at these experiences from many different perspectives, persecution diminishes, the hatred also begins to diminish, and the defenses begin to diminish, the splitting and the projection. And then there's less of a need for omnipotence and the grandiose sense of self. All of that begins to relax. In short, the goal is to help this kind of individual, this kind of person, to become increasingly aware of his own inner psychic reality. The more he can experience and feel and own his own destructive impulses, the less he will need to project them. You see, because right now, in the example that I gave, it's all coming from without, right? It was his mother, his neighbors, his colleagues. It's all coming from without. We need to help them begin to see that this also comes from within. Eventually, I help someone like this begin to see how they contribute to the spoiling of everything that they try. And I say eventually because, again, if you listen to some of my earlier episodes, There are different levels of interventions, and this is a later intervention. This only comes when you begin to have some buy-in and you can begin to help somebody become more curious about how they come to the conclusions that they come to without even actively questioning them. You see, this sort of thing cannot be done too quickly because then they will just feel blamed by you, right? In other words, if you help them begin to see that they create their own experience, they perceive their own perceptions, that they're spoiling things, they're just going to feel blamed and persecuted by you. And that's why timing is really important. And this is kind of a later level intervention, that the other stuff that happens first is all the stuff that I mentioned about projection a little bit earlier. So when this goes successfully, these individuals begin to establish the much needed, kind, or helpful inner world. In other words, by helping them question and see that maybe your mother's motives, like in this one example that I'm giving here, it's possible that your mother's motive was to infantilize you and not let you separate, not let you handle this like an adult, right? That's a possibility. But maybe your mother had other motives as well that you're leaving out of this. Like what? That maybe it speaks of love. In other words, maybe it was a loving gesture. That's a possibility too. And that's exactly the early kind of work that I would do with these individuals. And this is how we break this vicious cycle. So that was the goal of this episode. And I think I'm probably going to wrap it up here. But this is how we break the cycle. But I know there's much more to say. And I'm saying we can leave it here. But at the same time, I think what happens is as they begin to develop these loving, helpful, inner relationships, right? They don't need to cling to the sadomasochistic and hateful relationships. See, because the persecutory sadomasochistic, that's the fighting, by the way. I'm just using sadomasochistic. Those are the fights or the fighting that I described with this fellow, with the family. The more there are these fights and the more it separates them from good, creative, loving, helpful relationships. So that's what we begin as we begin to establish, as I questioned, what other motive might your mother have? We're beginning to help this kind of person fill their world with different types of relationships. And again, this is how we break the cycle. But there's so much more to say on the nature of sadomasochistic relationships. I just kind of snuck that in at the end. I didn't mean to complicate things even further, but just to make it very simple, that's the kind of struggle that happened with his mother. But these kinds of struggles are just so common amongst individuals with narcissistic characteristics. I think at some point we probably should discuss that, the nature of sadomasochistic struggles and what purpose they serve in this kind of individual's life. But regrettably, we must conclude our discussion here for now. However, as always, I encourage you to reach out with any questions or comments regarding any of these really complicated processes of projection and introjection. This topic is undeniably complex. And if there's anything I said today that caused you confusion, please feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to take it up in another episode or even respond to you directly. Okay, until next time, engage your mind. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.